Dearly beloved listeners, I am living proof that there is life after death. Little by little, I started losing my hearing in imperceptible increments until finally it was incapacitating, which is a rather difficult problem if you're in the business of broadcasting. So these days, I sit here with my hearing aids turned up to max and with the headphones blazing away, which enables me to tackle the next story, a book called The Invention of Miracles, Language, Power and Alexander Graham Bell's Quest to End Deafness, and its author, Katie Booth. It's a fine book which shows us a much different side to Bell, best known, of course, as the inventor of the telephone. But what isn't known about Bell is his fraught legacy in the deaf community, where he's seen as a villain. This new biography of the famous inventor explores his lifelong quest to teach the deaf to speak, and how his misguided war on sign language nearly destroyed not only a language but an entire and vivid culture. Katie teaches writing at the University of Pittsburgh. Her work has appeared in various mastheads, including Harper's Magazine. She was raised in a mixed hearing and deaf family, and many of her ancestors were deaf. Katie, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I vaguely have a memory that Alexander Bell used to clamp his teeth on the frame of a piano, all the better to hear it. But let's quickly go through his biography. He was born in Scotland.
Yeah, in Edinburgh. His mother was deaf. His father was an elocutionist. He taught. Today we would call him a speech pathologist, essentially.
And I understand that Father Melville invented a phonetic alphabet.
Yes, he invented an alphabet called visible speech, which sort of showed, through his alphabet, he was able to show people sort of how to shape their mouths and how to breathe in order to make different sounds. So since it was tethered to the mouth and the body, it was an alphabet for any language.
And I understand he passed this task on to Alec.
Yes. He taught all of his sons this alphabet, but specifically Alec Melville gave Alec the task of using the alphabet in order to teach deaf children how to speak.
Tragedy strikes the family. Bell's two brothers die. He falls sick with TB. And in 1870, the family moved to Canada. And Alec mopes around with nothing to do.
Yeah. He finds a little spot on a hill that he calls a sofa seat and just sits there and thinks a lot. And he also befriends the local Mohawk Indian tribe and studies their language. But for the most part, he's just moping around for a bit of time. He's also recovering because he was ill.
And he's, right from this point, he's well into oralism, isn't it? Which is teaching deaf children to speak.
Yeah, that was sort of the thing he was doing when he was yanked out of his life. He had started this career, which, it was something that he could do on his own that wasn't, it was related to his father's work, but it was really his. But this movement was also happening in America, so he was able to pivot the work.
Now, we're talking of a time when the deaf in the US were largely taught using American Sign Language, or ASL, but there were people who were opposed to sign language and thought the deaf should learn to speak, should be, in effect, forced to speak. Why the opposition to sign language?
Well, there's a lot of reasons, none of them very good, in my opinion. It was the Victorian era, and so there was this real focus on bodily control, on sort of a prim and proper way of being. And with that bias, people would look at sign language and it seemed so expressive, so almost flamboyant in comparison. And so there was some discomfort there. There was also in America at the time, there was, an influx of immigration. They were recovering from the Civil War, and they were pushing westward into indigenous territories. And essentially, there were just a lot of differences that needed to be, or that people believed needed to be reconciled. There was a tension on creating a sort of American culture that was singular. And it's when the idea of normalcy really took off and people wanted to make people normal.
I love the fact that signing seemed uncouth to a lot of people, especially the upper class, because the lack of bodily restraint. There's the incredible expressiveness of sign versus that sort of posh dignity.
So, I mean, at the time, sign looked a little different, but it still was quite expressive.
So oralism across the board was a part of a project of assimilation.
Yes, absolutely.
It's curious that Bell persisted with oralism when he opened his own school and failed to have results. The deaf community was deeply opposed to it. Was there any evidence that oralism worked?
Not widespread evidence, no. There were successes, of course. There were individual students who succeeded. Bell's own wife was an oralist student who succeeded. Of course, what success meant is culturally framed as well. In the hearing world, success meant that deaf people were able to move about in the hearing world. It did not necessarily mean they were happy or content or felt in community with each other. And so there were people who were able to learn to speak. There were also a great many people who were deeply traumatized by this education. And a lot of even the people who quote unquote succeeded at oralism found their way back to deaf culture in the end, and to other deaf people, found community in deafness. And that was a part of the story that the oralist did not tell, even though Bell himself funded a study that showed that was happening, that even oralist educations were not keeping deaf people from finding community with each other.
You remind us that, of course, Bell was busily researching, testing, and basically inventing what would be the telephone, but many people have forgotten the ongoing debate that Elisha Gray actually patented the technology first, and heavens above, Bell was plagued for years with lawsuits about whether or not he invented it.
Yeah, he sure was. And I don't know what it's like in Australia, but here in America, there was the Supreme Court passed, or sorry, not the Supreme Court, the House of Representatives passed a resolution to honor an Italian, Antonio Meucci, with the invention of the telephone. But yeah, there's the question of who invented the telephone is even today sort of still alive, but it's really more of a legal question than anything.
Well, these days we always talk about Bell and the telephone as synonymous, and of course it became ubiquitous. He meets Queen Victoria, he's feted by everybody, yet all he wants to do is teach oralism, and his fame and fortune meant that people listened to what he had to say.
Yes. He had a huge amount of power after the invention of the telephone because like you said, he had all this celebrity. It was also a really disproportionate amount of fame and power to the deaf people who were trying to advocate for themselves.
Now, unfortunately, he then does a segue towards eugenics. What was he advocating?
Bell was advocating for deaf people to not marry each other, specifically deaf people, and also hearing people with deaf people in their families. He believed that when deaf people married each other, they were more likely to have deaf children. And he had this sort of this idea that deaf people were procreating at a faster rate than hearing people, and that soon deafness was going to take over. It's very sort of alarmist idea. And so he was advocating for deaf people to choose not to marry each other.
And he pushes harder and harder and harder for pure oralism and for sign language to be banned.
Yeah, in the deaf schools, yeah.
No wonder the deaf activists increasingly saw him as determined to destroy the entirety of their culture.
He was determined to destroy their culture. Absolutely. They were correct in their assessment of the severity of the situation.
I understand that his wife, Mabel, who was deaf and had lost her hearing at the age of 5, did in time oppose his arguments.
Well, Mabel was very restrained in her pushback that I was able to see, but she did challenge him. She did begin to observe that at one point she wrote to him something like that his interest in the deaf children was more about their deafness than their humanity. And she started to become quite suspect of, for example, the way he was treating Helen Keller almost as an object to advance his ideas more than a person. And so she did become this voice of quiet resistance in that household, though he didn't really heed her suggestions of what was actually going on.
As I said when introducing you, this story is personal to you, as you were trained in a mixed hearing deaf family. Many of your ancestors were deaf, and you write very movingly about how you saw and heard the impact of Bell's fixation on oralism on your family.
Yeah, I mean, Bell, as in many people who are raised in deaf families, Bell's name was always a part of my childhood, always a name I knew. My grandparents and most of my great aunts and uncles were educated under the oralist method, and they had deep, enduring trauma over it. My grandmother grew up in a signing home, so when she went to school, she was forbidden from using the language that she already knew and shamed for using it. My grandfather grew up in a hearing family and went to school without any language. And because oralism was so difficult, he graduated school with no language too. He never learned English very well, certainly not at school. And it wasn't until his 20s that he started really learning sign.
And deaf family members were signing in secret, which I find absolutely poignant. And as you point out, because of Bell, people had come to see signing as, and I quote, stupid or weak or not quite human at all.
Yeah, you can see this language in the historical documents of they would talk about the deaf as like pre-human, or comparisons to animals and monkeys abounded. I mean, it was really, really, really harmful, the language that this method of education allowed for. Not just the language, but the way of thinking, the way of understanding deaf people as not people. And I think that on some level that endures, and you can see it in the way that hearing culture at large treats deaf people.
You're not anti-oralism, but you argue passionately that the legacy of stopping deaf people from signing has a number of deeper impacts, including, and I find this fascinating, neurological effects.
Yeah, I will say I am anti-oralism. I am not anti-speech. I think you can learn to speak without prohibiting sign language if that's what the deaf person wants to do. But yeah, prohibiting sign language often mean and focusing only on speech often means that deaf children aren't getting any language at all. It's what we call language deprivation. And here in America, there's a lot of organization right now to try and cut back on this. What ends up happening is if the deaf child doesn't get any language input during a very early window when their brains are um, sort of able to be shaped by language, then what ends up happening is there's permanent delays. I mean, not just permanent delays, permanent damage. Like you cannot repair that. And so if you don't offer a deaf child a fully accessible language at a very young age, you will create a situation of language deprivation and it cannot be reversed. You cannot go back later and offer sign language or English. You cannot reverse it. All those things will help the success. I mean, language access at any point will help, but depriving deaf children of accessible language has permanent neurological effects.
Katie, I'm shocked to learn from you that less than 8% of deaf children in the US grow up with regular sign language access.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because in in the hearing world, people think sign language is great for babies. You know, it's promoted all the time. We have baby signs, which was something conceived of by hearing people and has very little basis in actual linguistic sign language. But there's all this enthusiasm for teaching hearing babies sign language. I also should say this is not an irony that I am the first person to point out. Deaf people have been saying this for decades, that the hearing world is so interested in teaching sign language to hearing babies, but there's this myth that persists that for some reason sign language is going to be bad for deaf children. And so it's restricted from deaf children and given to hearing children. And it's this deeply unfair, violent act of cultural appropriation while also doing real damage to deaf children.
Katie, what's the impact of cochlear implants having?
Um, I think cochlear implants are widely seen as a tool, but certainly not a cure. I think in the hearing world, people think that they're a cure, that they fully restore hearing, and that's not true. Um, Cochlear implants can help some deaf people make sense of some sound, but it is not a cure. And what has happened is that oralism has sort of been rebranded under cochlear implants and used to teach children who have cochlear implants while still restricting the use of sign language when there's really not good evidence, good unbiased evidence that children need to be restricted from learning sign language in order to have success with cochlear implants.
Katie, thank you very much for your time. Katie Booth, author of The Invention of Miracles, Language, Power, and Alexander Graham Bell's Quest to End Deafness. It is published by Scribe. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much.